continue to stay in East Timor, the international community, they will simply digest East Timor and turn it into, trying to turn it into cash crop.
I mean, this is way beyond just demonstrating the subservience of the media to power. I mean, they have real complicity in genocide in this case. The reason that the atrocities can go on is because nobody knows about them. If anyone knew about them, there'd be protests and pressure to stop them. So therefore, by suppressing the facts, the media are making a major contribution to some of probably the worst act of genocide since the Holocaust.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because in fact, that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do. Nor would I say it. I mean,
right.
In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily.
Because your method is not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore the corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological agenda.
Totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example.
Okay.
One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely false. I mean, just ask the people who are involved in, I mean, you know, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. In fact, if you look at the things we've written, I mean, let's take a look. I mean, I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. You know, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? These are the things to keep in mind. These are not just academic exercises. We're not analyzing the media on Mars or in the 18th century or something like that. We're dealing with real human beings who are suffering and dying and being tortured and starving because of policies that we are involved in. We, as citizens of democratic societies, are directly involved in and are responsible for. And what the media are doing is ensuring that we do not act on our responsibilities and that the interests of power are served, not the needs of the suffering people, and not even the needs of the American people, who would be horrified if they realized the blood that's dripping from their hands because of the way they're allowing themselves to be deluded and manipulated by the system. What about the third world? Well, despite everything, and it's pretty ugly and awful, these struggles are not over. The struggle for freedom and independence never is completely over. Their courage, in fact, is really remarkable and amazing. I've personally had the privilege, and it is a privilege, of witnessing it a few times in villages in Southeast Asia and Central America, and recently in the occupied West Bank, and it is astonishing to see. And it's always amazing, at least to me it's amazing, I can't understand it. It's also very moving and very inspiring. In fact, it's kind of awe-inspiring. Now, they rely very crucially on a very slim margin for survival that's provided by dissidence and turbulence within the imperial societies. And how large that margin is for us to determine.
In today's on-the-spot assignment, we're going to see just what's behind the making of movies. The director and the crew are shooting a documentary film. Let's take a closer look. Bob, this word documentary, what would you say is the difference between a documentary film and a feature movie?
Well, there are a good many differences. One would be length. Generally speaking, documentaries are a good deal shorter than feature films. Also, documentaries have something to say in the way of a message. They are informational films. Also, another term that's used interchangeably with documentary is the word actuality films.
Bob, is this the thing you hold up in front of the camera before each scene?
This is a clapperboard, yes. This identifies on the visual camera the scene number and the take number, and also, as you heard, on the soundtrack. The editor back at the studio puts the two pieces of film together, matches where the lips of the clapper come together, and there you are in sync.
Before the break, you were mentioning the media putting forth the information that the power elite want. I'm not sure if I understand, how does the power elite do this, and why do we stand for it? Why does it work so well?
Okay, well, I think here we have to, I mean, there are really two questions here. One, is this picture of the media true? And there you have to look at the evidence. I mean, I've given one example, and that shouldn't convince anybody. One has to look at a lot of evidence to see whether this is true. I think anyone who investigates it will find out that the evidence to support it is simply overwhelming. In fact, it's probably one of the best supported conclusions in the social sciences. But the other question is, how does it work?
Your choice, right? I'm the media guy.
You're the media.
What would you like? I got you an International Herald Tribune. Want anything in a Western language which doesn't exist? What do you got? Financial Times?
Absolutely. That's the only paper that tells the truth.
Did you get the one where they've been debating back and forth?
NRC Handelsblatt.
Handelsblatt.
Okay, that's the...
Well, this evening's program is scheduled as a debate, which puzzled me all the way through. There are some problems. One problem is that no proposition has been set forth. As I understand debate, people are supposed to advocate something and oppose something. Rather more sensibly, a topic has been proposed for discussion. The topic is manufacture of consent.
It's somewhat unusual for a member of the government to debate with a professor in public. It hasn't happened in Holland before. I don't think it's often happens elsewhere.
Mr. Borgestein, the floor is yours.
Now, we all know that the theory can never be established merely by examples. It can only be established by showing some internal inherent logic. Professor Chomsky has not done so.
Professor Chomsky?
He's quite right when he says you can't just pick examples. You have to do them in a rational way. That's why we compared examples.
The truth is that things are not as simple as Professor Chomsky maintains. Another of Professor Chomsky's case studies concerns the treatment that Cambodia has received in the Western press. Here he goes badly off the rails.
We didn't discuss Cambodia. We compared Cambodia with East Timor, two very closely paired examples. And we gave approximately 300 pages of detail covering this in Political Economy of Human Rights, including a reference to every article we could discover about Cambodia.
Many Western intellectuals do not like to face the facts and balk at the conclusions that any untutored person would draw.
Many people are very irritated by the fact that we exposed the extraordinary deceit over Cambodia and paired it with the simultaneous suppression of the U.S.-supported ongoing atrocities in Timor. People don't like that. For one thing, we were challenging the right to lie in defense of the state. For another thing, we were exposing the apologetics and support for actual ongoing atrocities, that doesn't make you popular.
Where did he learn about the atrocities in East Timor or in Central America, if not in the same free press which he so derides?
You can find out where I learned about them by looking at my footnotes. I learned about them from human rights reports, from church reports, from refugee studies, and extensively from the Australian press. There was nothing from the American press because it was silenced.
Chairman, this is an attempt at intellectual intimidation. These are the ways of the bully. Professor Chomsky uses the oldest debating trick on record. He erects a man of straw and proceeds to hack away at him. Professor Chomsky calls this the manufacture of consent. I call it the creation of consensus. In Holland we call it draagvlak, which means foundation. Professor Chomsky thinks it is deceitful, but it is not. In a representative democracy, it means winning people for one's point of view. But I do not think that Professor Chomsky believes in representative democracy. I think he believes in direct democracy. With Rosa Luxemburg, he longs for the creative, spontaneous, self-correcting force of mass action. That is the vision of the anarchist. It is also a boy's dream.
Those who believe in democracy and freedom have a serious task ahead of them. What they should be doing, in my view, is dedicating their efforts to helping the despised common people to struggle for their rights and to realize the democratic goals that constantly surface throughout history. They should be serving not power and privilege, but rather their victims. Freedom and democracy are by now not merely values to be treasured, they are quite possibly the prerequisite to survival.
It's a conspiracy theory, pure and simple. It is not borne out by the facts. Mr. Chairman, I have to go to Amsterdam. If you'll excuse me, I'm leaving.
One thing is sure. Their consent has not been manufactured tonight.
There is nothing more remote from what I'm discussing, or what we have been discussing, than a conspiracy theory. If I give an analysis of, say, the economic system, and I point out that General Motors tries to maximize profit and market share, that's not a conspiracy theory. That's an institutional analysis. It has nothing to do with conspiracies. And that's precisely the sense in which we're talking about the media. The phrase conspiracy theory is one of those that's constantly brought up, and I think its effect simply is to discourage institutional analysis.
Do you think there's a connection somehow about what the government wants us to know and what the media tell us?
It's not communism, but I think to a certain point, it is sensitized.
They don't always tell, I guess, John, they don't always tell the truth the way it goes, huh?
Got that right.
You think that the information you're getting from this paper is biased in any way? Or?
Oh, yeah. I think by and large it's well done. You get both sides of the stories. You get the liberal and the side and the conservative side, so to speak.
But I don't think you get a very balanced picture because they only have 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a news item or whatever, and they're going to pick out a highlight, and every network is going to cover the same highlight, and that's all you're going to see.
You get what they want you to hear.
You think they're biased in some way then?
Yeah. Here we go. See you later.
Is it possible for the lights to get a little brighter so I can see somebody out there?
Yeah, for the last hour and 41 minutes, you've been whining about how the elite and how the government have been using thought control to keep radicals like yourself out of the public limelight. Now, you're here. I don't see any CIA men waiting to drag you off. You were in the paper. That's where everyone here heard you were coming from, in the paper, and I'm sure they're going to publish your comments in the paper. Now, a lot of countries, you would have been shot for what you have done today. So what are you whining about? We are allowing you to speak, and I don't see any thought control.
First of all, I hadn't said one word about my being kept out of the limelight. The way it works here is quite different. Now, I don't think you heard what I was saying, but the way it works here is that there is a system of shaping, control, and so on, which gives a certain perception of the world. I gave one example. I'll give you sources where you can find thousands of others. And it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with marginalizing the public and ensuring that they don't get in the way of elites who are supposed to run things without interference.
In a review of the Chomsky Reader, it was written that as he's been forced to the margins, he's become strident and rigid. Do you feel this categorization of your later writings is accurate and that you've been a victim of this sort of process you've been describing?
Well, the business about being forced to other people will have to judge about the stridency. I don't believe it, but anyway, that's for other people to judge. However, the matter of being forced to the margins is a matter of fact, and the fact is the opposite of what is claimed. The fact is it's much easier to gain access to even the major media now than it was 20 years ago.
You've dealt in such unpopular truths and have been such a lonely figure as a consequence of that. Do you ever regret either that you took the stand you took, have written the things you have written, or that we had listened to you earlier?
I don't. I mean, there are particular things which I would do differently because you think about things, you do them differently. But in general, I would say I do not regret it. I mean,
do you like being controversial?
No, it's a nuisance.
Because this mass medium pays little attention to the views of dissenters, not just Noam Chomsky, but most dissenters do not get much of a hearing in this medium.
No, in fact, that's, again, completely understandable. They wouldn't be performing their societal function if they allowed favored truths to be challenged. Now, notice that that's not true when I cross the border anywhere, so that I have easy access to the media in just about every other country in the world. There's a number of reasons for that, and one reason is I'm primarily talking about the United States, and it's much less threatening.
Your view there is that the militarization of the American economy essentially has come about because there are not other means of controlling the American population.
In a democratic society. I mean, it may be paradoxical, but the freer the society is, the more it's necessary to resort to devices like induced fear.
Okay, I'll go along with that. Arguably, he is the most important intellectual alive today. And if my program can give him 500,000 people listening or 750,000 people listening, I'll be delighted. Okay, Professor, and you're on time.
Wartime planners understood that actual war aims should not be revealed.
Part of the reason why the media in Canada and Belgium and so on are more open is that it just doesn't matter that much what people think. It matters very much what the politically articulate sectors of the population, those narrow minorities, think and do in the United States because of its overwhelming dominance on the world scene. But of course, that's also a reason for wanting to work here.
What we might call the fifth freedom, the freedom to rob, exploit, and dominate, and to curb mischief by any feasible means.
Conclude, not include. The United States is ideologically narrower in general than other countries. Furthermore, the structure of the American media is such as to pretty much eliminate critical discussion.
Our guests are as far apart on the contra question as American intellectuals can be.
Now, if we had the slightest concern with democracy, which we do not in our foreign affairs and never have, we would turn to countries where we have influence, like El Salvador. Now, in El Salvador, they don't call the archbishop bad names. What they do is murder him. They do not censor the press. They wipe the press out. They sent the army in to blow up the church radio station. The editor of the independent newspaper was found in a ditch, mutilated and cut to pieces with machete. May I continue? I did not interrupt you.
Don't you ever want to put a time value on anything you say?
Excuse me, that was I'm talking about 1980.
You are a systematic liar.
Did these things happen or didn't they?
These things did not happen in the context in which you suggested
really?
All. You are a phony, mister, and it's time that the people read you correctly.
It's clear why you want to divert me from the discussion.
No, it's not. It's because you just get tired of rubbish.
But let's continue with...
Except we can't. I'm afraid we're out of time. We thank you both, John Silber and Noam Chomsky.
Okay.
Last time you were here, you spoke about how when you go overseas, you are given access to the mass media. But here, that doesn't seem to be the case. Has that changed at all? Have you ever been invited to appear on Nightline or Brinkley?
Yes, I have a couple times been invited to speak on Nightline. Couldn't do it. I had another talk and something or other. And to tell you the honest truth, I don't really care very much. FAIR, the media monitoring group, published a very interesting study of Nightline. It shows that their conception of a spectrum of opinion is ridiculously narrow, at least by European or world standards. Let me tell you a personal experience. I happened to be in Madison, Wisconsin, on a listener-supported radio station, community radio station, a very good one. I was having an interview with the news director. I've been on that program dozens of times, usually by telephone, and he's very good. He gets to all sorts of people, and he started the interview by playing for me a tape of an interview that he had just had and had broadcast with the guy who's some mucky-muck in Nightline. I think his name is Jeff Greenfield or some such name. Does that name mean anything?
I'm Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
What about just in the selection of guests to analyze things? Why is Noam Chomsky never on Nightline?
I couldn't begin to tell you.
He's one of the leading intellectuals in the entire world.
I have no idea. I mean, I can make some guesses. He may be one of the leading intellectuals who can't talk on television. You know, that's a standard that's very important to us. If you got a 22-minute show and a guy takes 5 minutes to warm up, now, I don't know whether Chomsky does or not. He's out. One of the reasons why Nightline has the usual suspects is one of the things you have to do when you book a show is know that the person can make the point within the framework of television. And if people don't like that, they should understand it is about as sensible to book somebody who will take 8 minutes to give an answer as it is to book somebody who doesn't speak English. But in the normal given flow, that's another culture-bound thing. We got to have English-speaking people. We also need concision.
So Greenfield, or whatever his name is, hit the nail on the head. The U.S. media are alone in that it is, you must meet the condition of concision. You got to say things between two commercials or in 600 words. And that's a very important fact, because the beauty of concision, you know, saying a couple of sentences between two commercials, the beauty of that is that you can only repeat conventional thoughts.
I was reading Chomsky 20 years ago. I think his notion, didn't he co-author a new book called Engineering Consent or The Manufacturing of Consent? I mean, some of that stuff to me looks like it's from Neptune.
This is the first time the Neptune system has been seen clearly by human eyes. These pictures, taken only hours ago by Voyager 2, are its latest contribution.
You know, he's perfectly entitled to say that I'm seeing it through a prism, too. But my view of that, of his notions about the limits of debate in this country, is absolutely wacko.
Suppose I get up on Nightline, say, I'm given whatever it is, 2 minutes, and I say Gaddafi is a terrorist, Khomeini is a murderer, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The Russians, you know, invaded Afghanistan, all this sort of stuff. I don't need any evidence. Everybody just nods. On the other hand, suppose you say something that just isn't regurgitating conventional pieties. Suppose you say something that's the least bit unexpected or controversial. Suppose you say,
I mean, the biggest international terror operations that are known are the ones that are run out of Washington.
Or suppose you say, what happened in the 1980s is the U.S. government was driven underground. Suppose I say the United States is invading South Vietnam, as it was. The best political leaders are the ones who are lazy and corrupt. If the Nuremberg laws were applied, then every post-war American president would have been hanged.
The Bible is probably the most genocidal book in our total canon.
Education is a system of imposed ignorance.
There's no more morality in world affairs fundamentally than there was in the time of Genghis Khan. They're just different, you know, they're just different factors to be concerned with.
Now, Chomsky, thank you.
For that hope is seen, oh, one more, oh, mankind, just to save his own. You must have pity on them, because their chances grow thin. But there won't be no hiding from the king's throne. All aboard our town, you better get on board. All aboard our town, you better get on board. All aboard our town, you better get on board. All aboard.
You know, people will quite reasonably expect to know what you mean. Why did you say that? I never heard that before. If you said that, you better have a reason, you know, better have some evidence. In fact, you better have a lot of evidence, because that's a pretty startling comment. You can't give evidence if you're stuck with concision, you know. That's the genius of this structural constraint. And in my view, if people like, say, Nightline and McNeil Lehrer and so on were smarter, if they were better propagandists, they would let dissidents on. Let them on more, in fact. The reason is that they would sound like they're from Neptune.
Then comes our special conversation on the Middle East crisis. Tonight's is with the activist, writer, and professor Noam Chomsky.
Again, there has been an offer on the table, which we rejected, an Iraqi offer last April, to eliminate their chemical and other unconventional arsenals if Israel were to simultaneously do the same.
Have to end it there.
But I think that should be pursued as well.
Sorry to interrupt you. I have to end it there. That's the end of our time. Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for joining us.
AT&T has supported the McNeil Lehrer News Hour since 1983 because quality information and quality communications is our idea of a good connection. AT&T, the right choice.
Oh, okay. If you just sit there for half a second, it's just for two shots, that's all, and we can do everything else. Okay. What about the mic? Is that
I think there's some hanging around here.
Right, the idea of this one is it's just a shot where I'm seen talking to you and you're seen listening to me. I'll ask you, though, if you don't speak to me or move your lips so that I can be seen to be asking you a question. The reason for the shot is simply this.
I'm used to it.
Okay, just don't talk to me and I'll keep going, that's the thing. The reason for the shot, I'll explain it through because I usually find that's the easiest way to do it. The reason for the shot is I need a shot where you're sitting and seen, listening to me while I'm asking you a question. We can use the shot to introduce you, explain who you are, where you fit into the piece I'm doing. But if you don't speak to me, I can also use... Got it? Okay, thanks for your time. Righto.
If there is a narrower range of opinion in the United States, and it is harder to express a variety of different opinions, why do you live in the U.S.?
Well, I think well, first of all, it's my country, and secondly, it's in many ways, as I said before, it's the freest country in the world. I mean, I think there's more possibilities for change here than in any other country I know. But again, comparatively speaking, it's the country where the state is probably most restricted.
But isn't that what you should be looking at comparatively rather than in absolute terms? But you don't create that impression.
On the contrary, well, maybe I don't give the impression. I certainly say it often enough. What I've said over and over again, and I've been saying it all tonight, I've written it 1,000,000 times, is that the United States is a very free society. It's also a very rich society. Of course, the United States is a scandal from the point of view of its wealth. I mean, given the natural advantages that the United States has in terms of resources and lack of enemies and so on, the United States should have a level of health and welfare and so on that's, you know, an order of magnitude beyond anybody else in the world. We don't. The United States is last among 20 industrialized societies in infant mortality. That's a scandal of American capitalism. And it ends up being a very free society, which does a lot of rotten things in the world. Okay? There's no contradiction there. I mean, you know, Greece was a free society by the standards of Athens, you know. It's also a vicious society from the point of view of its imperial behavior. There's virtually no correlation between maybe none, between the internal freedom of a society and its external behavior.
You start your line of discussion at a moment that is historically useful for you.
That's what I say. You pick the beginning.
Of the post-war world is that the communist imperialists, by the use of terrorism, by deprivation of freedom, have contributed to the continuing bloodshed. And the sad thing about it is not only the bloodshed, but the fact they seem to dispossess you of the power of rational observation.
May I say something?
Sure.
I think that's about 5% true, and about, or maybe 10% true. It certainly is true.
Why do you give that?
May I complete a sentence?
Sure.
I mean, it's perfectly true that there were areas of the world, in particular Eastern Europe, where Stalinist imperialism very brutally took control and still maintains control. But there are also very vast areas of the world where we were doing the same thing. And there's quite an interplay in the Cold War. You see, what you just described is I believe, a mythology about the Cold War, which might have been tenable 10 years ago, but which is quite inconsistent with contemporary scholarship.
Ask a Czech.
Ask a Guatemalan, ask a Dominican, ask a person from the Dominican Republic, ask a person from South Vietnam, ask a Thai.
Well, obviously, we can't get away. If you can't distinguish between the nature of our venture in Guatemala and the nature of the Soviet Union's in Prague, then we have real difficulty.
Explain the difference.
Sorry.
Now, what about making the media more responsive and democratic? Well, there are very narrow limits for that. It's kind of like asking, how do we make corporations more democratic? Well, the only way to do that is get rid of them, I mean, if you have concentrated power, you can, I mean, I don't want to say you can do nothing. Like you can, like the church can show up at the stockholders meeting and start screaming about not investing in South Africa. And sometimes that has marginal effects. I don't want to say it has no effects. But you can't really affect the structure of power, because to do that would be a social revolution. And unless you're ready for a social revolution, that is, power is going to be somewhere else, the media are going to have their present structure and they're going to represent their present interests. Now, that's not to say that one shouldn't try to do things. I mean, it makes sense to try to push the limits of a system.
It only takes one or two people that think they have integrity as journalists to give you some good press.
See, that's important, and that goes back to something that came up before. I mean, there's a lot, there are things are complex. It's not monolithic. I mean, the mass media themselves are complicated institutions with internal contradictions. So on the one hand, there's the commitment to indoctrination and control. But on the other hand, there's the sense of professional integrity.
She works alone, as her own boss, writing newspaper columns and producing radio commentaries for a hodgepodge of small clients across the country. This so-called leather-lung Texan has been firing questions at our chief executives for almost 40 years.
Many a young man in this country is being disillusioned totally by his government these days.
Well, this is a question which you very properly bring to the attention of the nation. It's not that we haven't been holding press conferences. I was just waiting for Sarah to come back.
Mr. President, that's very nice of you, and I appreciate it. Sir, I want to call your attention to a real problem we've got in this country today.
Those unique and often terrifying McClendon questions reflect her desire to dig out information.
And I wanted to ask your new man what he feels
With enough know-how and persistence, she usually gets her man.
What would you do if you were in a situation where you were trying to be an honest reporter and you were worried sick about your country and you saw how sick it was, and you were facing this weak White House and a weak Congress as a reporter? What would you do?
I think there are a lot of reporters who do a very good job. In fact, I have a lot of friends in the press who I think do a terrific job.
I know they are, but I mean, they want to, but now what?
Well, you have to first of all, you have to understand what the system is, and smart reporters do understand what it is. You have to understand what the pressures are, what the commitments are, what the barriers are, and what the openings are. Like right after the Iran-Contra hearings, a lot of good reporters understood, well, things are going to be a little more open for a couple of months. So they could ram through stories that they knew they couldn't even talk about before.
After Watergate.
And the same after Watergate. And then, it closes up again and so on. Most people, I imagine, simply internalize the values. That's the easiest way and the most successful way. You just internalize the values, and then you regard yourself, in a way, correctly as acting perfectly freely.
All right, let's get to the White House now, where I think veteran correspondent Frank Sesno could tell us a little bit about self-censorship. That inertial guidance system is always going on, isn't it? Is there any formal censorship there?
Well, there's no self-censorship, Reed. If somebody tells me something, I'm going to pass it on, unless there's a particular and compelling reason not to. I can't deny that I wouldn't like to have access to the Oval Office and all the same maps and charts and graphs that the president's looking at, but that's not possible, it's not realistic, and it's probably not even desirable.
Hello. How are you? I'm fine. Can I sit down there, please? Welcome
to Holland. I'll introduce you first in a few lines. Professor Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, is nu 60 en is ongeveer de meest controversiële intellectueel van Amerika. Dat is ook alweer een platitude, maar zo wordt hij nu eenmaal altijd genoemd.
Chomsky has been called the Einstein of modern linguistics. The New York Times has said he's arguably the most important intellectual alive today. But his presence here has sparked a protest.
This book that has poisoned the world, and all liar in there. And as a Vietnamese people, we come here to learn the book. Vietnam! Vietnam!
He said that in Vietnam there's no violation of human rights and no crime in Cambodia is wrong.
Chomsky he's a professor. He's using that to poison the world. And we come here to protest that.
I don't mind the denunciations, frankly. I mind the lies. Well, I mean, intellectuals are very good at lying. They're professionals at it. You know, vilification is a wonderful technique. There's no way of responding to it. If somebody calls you, an anti-Semite, what can you say? I'm not an anti-Semite. Or, somebody says you're a racist, you're a Nazi or something. You always lose. I mean, the person who throws in the mud always wins because there's no way of responding to such charges.
Professor Chomsky seems to believe that the people he criticizes fall into one of two classes, liars or dupes. Consider what happens when I discuss the case of Robert Faurisson. Let me recall the facts.
Let's not go into details, please, because
the details happen to be important.
Yes, but I have only one question on the Faurisson question.
Do the facts matter or don't they matter?
Of course they do.
Well, let me tell you what the facts are.
Faurisson says that the massacre of the Jews in the Holocaust is a historic lie.
No, this is an important one. It has a lot to do with the topic.
Your views are extremely controversial, and perhaps one of the things that has been most controversial and you've been most strongly criticized for was your defense of a French intellectual who was suspended from his university post for contending that there were no Nazi death camps in World War II.
My name is Robert Faurisson. I am 60. I am university professor in Lyon, France. Behind me, you may see the courthouse of Paris, the Palais de Justice. In this place, I was convicted many times at the beginning of the 80s. I was charged by 9 associations, mostly Jewish associations, for inciting hatred, racial hatred, for racial defamation, for damage by falsifying a story.
Professor Chomsky and a number of other intellectuals signed a petition in which Faurisson is called a respected professor of literature who merely tried to make his findings public.
Perhaps we can start with just the story of Robert Faurisson and your involvement.
More than 500 people signed, maybe 600, mostly universitaires, scholars.
And what happened to the other 499 of them? How come we only hear about Chomsky's signature?
Well, I think it's because Chomsky is in himself a kind of political power.
I signed a petition calling on the tribunal to defend his civil rights. At that point, the French press, which apparently has no conception of freedom of speech, concluded that since I had called for his civil rights, I was therefore defending his theses.
Faurisson then published a book in which he tried to prove that the Nazi gas chambers never existed.
What we deny is that there was an extermination program and an extermination actually, especially in gas chambers or gas vans.
The book contains a preface written by Professor Chomsky in which he calls Faurisson a relatively apolitical sort of liberal.
A communist is a man, a Jew is a man, a Nazi is a man, I am a man.
Are you a Nazi?
I am not a Nazi.
How would you describe yourself politically?
Nothing.
preface that you wrote, whether you retracted it.
That's not the preface that I wrote, because I never wrote a preface. You know that I never wrote a preface.
Yeah, we done, okay.
He's referring to a statement of mine on civil liberties, which was added to a book in which excuse me. Yes, I use...
And the language you use has meaning.
That's right.
And
the language I use...
A political liberal, or as someone whose views can be dignified by the words findings or conclusions, that is a judgment, and that is a favorable judgment of his views.
On the contrary.
Can I continue with the facts?
Yes, you can continue with the facts for hours, but I mean, there are few facts that, yeah, okay.
Let's get to the so-called preface. I was then asked by the person who organized the petition to write a statement on freedom of speech, just banal comments about freedom of speech, pointing out the difference between defending a person's right to express his views and defending the views expressed. So I did that. I wrote a rather banal statement called Some Elementary Remarks on Freedom of Expression, and I told him, do what you like with it.
So Pierre produced a book which all the arguments of Faurisson were to be put in front of the court. And we thought wise to use the text of Noam Chomsky as a kind of warning, a foreword, to say that it was a matter of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of research.
Why did you try at the last moment to get it back from the book?
That's the one thing I'm sorry about.
But that's the real important thing.
It's
of
not.
Course,
You know the fact that I tried to retract
it? With that you said it was wrong of you
I
to
didn't.
do it.
See, in fact, take a look at what I wrote a letter, which was then publicized, in which I said, look, things have reached the point where the French intellectual community simply is incapable of understanding the issues. At this point, it's just going to confuse matters even more if my comments on freedom of speech happen to be attached to this book, which I didn't know existed. So just to clarify things, you better separate them. Now, in retrospect, I think I probably shouldn't have done that. I should have just said, fine, then let it appear, because it ought to appear. But that's, apart from that, I regard this as not only trivial, but as compared with other positions I've taken on freedom of speech, invisible.
I do not think that the state ought to have the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from it. I'm not willing to give the state that right, even if they happen to
But are you denying that the gas chambers never existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech, and you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything like objectivity, or scientific objectivity, reality? As a scientist,
look, I'm not saying I defend the views. Look, if somebody publishes a scientific article, which I disagree with, I do not say the state ought to put him in jail, right?
All right, but you don't have to support him right away and say, you know, I support him just for the sake of everybody saying that, you know, whatever he wants to say.
Suppose this guy is taken to court and charged with falsification. Then I'm going to defend him, even if I disagree.
But he wasn't taken to court.
Oh, you're wrong.
But when did you write to support? I mean,
when he was brought to court. And in fact, the only support that I gave him is to say he has a right of freedom of speech, period.
There is no doubt in my mind that the example that I gave about this story is the Holocaust did not exist is very, very typical. I'll give you another example about
how much of the American press believes that Faurisson has anything to say, or any press? How much of the press in France?
Since I followed...
What percentage would you say?
I'll tell you.
Is it higher than zero? Is it higher than zero?
I'll tell you.
Have you ever seen anything in any newspaper or any journal saying that this man is anything other than a lunatic?
I'll try to answer. I'll try to answer. I think that I just followed the case.
That's a simple question.
I followed the case 5 or 6 years ago, and I happened to see that Noam Chomsky was in for strong criticism, even from some of his supporters, for doing something which could be interpreted only in terms of a campaign against Israel.
Going back years, I am absolutely certain that I've taken far more extreme positions on people who deny the Holocaust than you have. For example, you go back to my earliest articles and you will find that I say that even to enter into the arena of debate on the question of whether the Nazis carried out such atrocities is already to lose one's humanity. So I don't even think you ought to discuss the issue if you want to know my opinion. But if anybody wants to refute Faurisson, there's certainly no difficulty in doing so.
I'm not interested in freedom of speech and all that. I have to win.